development methods used in the belt of Brevis. Although we skipped over how things grown in space are dealt with, it's probably best to push that topic aside for a description of the habitats and colonial clusters they originate from, and move on to the next step in the chain. So now that the process of extraplanetary extraction has been finished, how is all of this transported down to the planetary and lunar colonies? Well, generally speaking, it isn't. Most times, surface mining and other forms of resource procurement are perfectly functional for the needs of surface industries. Ore is not needed in quantities such that surface mined resources are incapable of sustaining the market, especially since, until relatively recently, most resources any person would ever come into contact with came from Incuna. Extraplanetary and exoplanetary needs are very uncommon. Although Incunan exports make up a lot of the trade between colonies, the incredible ease of mining on Incuna and tailor-made infrastructure of Dolichus negate the need for spaceborne resources to be trucked down to them alongside domestic products. This leaves most of the minerals and raw resources procured in space to be used in the Brevis colony or colonial clusters of space factories and stations. There are exceptions to this, however, namely the gold standard of the initial push for belt mining. Gold. Along with other economically tied or exceedingly rare substances, gold is often trucked down by either private entities to be sold later, or various groups operating under the imperial government to be stockpiled for currency backing or auction. Although to lessen the scope, true intercolonial trade will be omitted for this section. Resources produced in colonial clusters are often sent to surface colonies as well. This includes, but is not limited to, crops, especially bioengineered or foreign crops, mass-produced heavy machinery, energy cells, and even basic construction components like nuts, bolts, screws, and the like. This begs the question of why a large percentage of megacorporations routinely employ space-to-surface mining and ventures on an internal level. If surface-to-surface dealings with materials of all kinds are generally considered to be more economically viable, even for the empire as a whole, why is it that the greatest creators of capital often fly in the opposite direction? There are three reasons this practice has the ability to be profitable. The first reason being the corporation in question already having space dealings and deciding not to try for surface sites or sellers. The second is the corporation being set up in an area with economically prohibitive blocks to gaining resources they need, and space being less prohibitive alternative. Third, space construction is unviable compared to just shipping down materials for whatever reason. All of these have very prominent examples able to be looked into. Over the Moon, the extracolonial manufacturing and development giant has an incredibly large amount of property in space. As the pioneers of the modern space industry, that's to be expected. So it's not hard to believe that anything requiring space manufacture is better supplied with their own internal stockpile of materials. The second was a staple of consortium companies before the Winter's War. They would often set up manufacturing and distribution centers near major economic hotspots like Rundu, Trelu, Seoul, and London. These hotspots have lots of competition or regulation around various types of trade and bulk shipments. To meet the rapid production cycles, it was more viable to ship in materials internally from cheaper space ventures. Lastly, this niche usually sits between just acquiring surface materials and the niche just discussed. Companies that buy spaceborne raw materials already readily available on their colony have an economic incentive not to buy from surface industry, but not enough to justify their own space sector. This is often an intermittent shipping practice, or just not high enough in difference to be pulling the same profit while running and supplying something in space. So, now that what is shipped down and why has been established, how is it done? The answer, for the most part, lies in vacuum tankers. Although some shipping can be done from space elevators, the vast majority of space-to-surface trade is handled by vacuum tankers. Vacuum tankers are barges filled with material to be sent down to the surface of a colony. They, weighted down by their payload, are able to safely and controllably descend to the unloading level. This requires specialized vacuum tankers for every type of payload size, with the smallest raw stock VTs used for transporting certain Shika crystals, only growable in vacuum, and the largest to haul ore that's undergone initial steps to refinement. In order to accept these payloads, a myriad of port types, most commonly configured to the type of resources to be received, have to be constructed. Traditional VTOL cargo ports for domestic sector products can serve as smaller or specialty vacuum tankers like those delivering gold bars to the Empire. However, this is an exception to the rule. Normally, vats, holds, and other massive storage containment structures are constructed. On the rarest of occasions, short-range cargo haulers, especially those made to ferry a small collection of cargo containers from hypermassive maritime ships, are also retrofitted to serve as vacuum tankers. However, this practice is pretty much only used by Red Winter War cleanup efforts or in Soviet and Eastern European provinces near a traditional vacuum tanker port. Once a vacuum tanker has unloaded, it has become lighter than air in terms of the average density and will be allowed to float to a higher layer of the atmosphere. Once they reach the peak of their ascent, tugboats will latch onto and pull it into an orbital facility. Given large distance between resting height and geostationary orbit, sometimes a pipeline will be extended to supply the tanker fuel to ascend further. Other times, the station itself operates at a height less than geostationary and applies active countermeasures not to fall. It's also possible to have an intermediate vehicle or vehicles that quickly load a vacuum tanker at its resting height and allow it to descend without ever actually meeting its respective space station. Of course, raw materials are not the only items shipped in space trade. That's why it's imperative to continue this series with the wonders of space manufacturing when we next return. Hopefully, you'll tune in to the rest of what's to come.